Mirrors, they have always seemed so simple to us, a reflection of reality. But have you ever wondered what truly lies behind that smooth surface? What if a mirror is not just glass but something more? What if it sees more than it should? And what if, one day, it stops showing you as you truly are? This story began with an old mirror. Its appearance was like something from a past century. A dark, carved wooden frame and glass that had dimmed with age. But those who had ever encountered this mirror said they felt something strange. As if someone was watching them from the other side. As if their reflections had lives of their own. At first, these were just legends, whispers passed from one person to another. But they all shared one thing in common. People who stared into the mirror for too long changed. And none of them could explain what exactly had happened. The mirror disappeared for years, as though time itself had hidden it from human sight. But that didn't mean it ceased to be dangerous. Its trace always remained. In stories, in terrifying dreams, in the feeling that your reflection might take a breath just as you turn away. This story is about what happened to Elizabeth when she allowed the mirror to see just a little more than it should have. Elizabeth returned to the house that now belonged solely to her. Old, creaky, filled with heavy air and the scent of dust. This house was her grandmother's legacy. Her grandmother had lived here her entire life, filling every corner with memories, old furniture, and objects that seemed to breathe antiquity. But now, all of it felt strange, distant, like a lone tree standing in the middle of a field. She spent several days unpacking boxes, opening cupboards, and clearing the rooms of dust. Every item reminded her of her grandmother, her voice, her warnings. "Don't touch the mirror in the attic, dear," she had said more than once. "Don't look into it and everything will be fine." But back then, those words had seemed like nothing more than tales, superstitions of an old woman not worth paying attention to. The attic was the last place left to clean. Climbing the narrow wooden stairs that creaked with every step, Elizabeth felt the air grow heavier. The attic greeted her with darkness and the musty smell of damp. Her eyes landed on a large sheet draped over something tall and massive. As she stepped closer, her heart began to pound. She knew what it was. Pulling the cloth away, she revealed the mirror. Its frame was heavy, carved from dark wood, adorned with intricate patterns that resembled either branches or contorted faces. The glass wasn't entirely clear, as if time had left its mark on it. She ran her hand over its surface, wiping away the dust, and felt a faint chill. Something about the mirror made her linger a moment longer than she should have, but she quickly looked away, recalling her grandmother's words. Nonsense, Elizabeth thought. It was just an old object, a little eerie, but wasn't everything in this house like that? She decided the mirror would make a beautiful addition to her new living room. After all, it was a family heirloom, and leaving it to gather dust in the attic seemed unfair. She carried the mirror downstairs and placed it in a bright room, near the window, where daylight fell on its frame, giving it an almost enchanting appearance. It was no longer just part of the old house. It was now part of her new life. She didn't even notice the faint shadowy flicker that passed through the glass as she turned her back and left the room. The mirror had been standing in the living room for several days. Elizabeth had almost gotten used to its presence. She even joked to herself about how it added a certain charm to the room, though it was slightly unsettling. But over time, something began to change. One morning, as she was making herself coffee in the kitchen, her gaze accidentally fell on the mirror in the living room. She froze. The reflection she saw seemed strange. The figure in the mirror appeared at a slightly different angle than she expected. But that could just be a trick of the light, couldn't it? Elizabeth looked away and tried not to think about it. But the next time she walked past the mirror, her attention was drawn to yet another oddity. She froze in place, for her reflection seemed to keep moving for just a split second after she had stopped. She shuddered but quickly dismissed the thought, explaining it away as fatigue or a trick of her imagination. Yet every time she passed the mirror, she felt as if it was watching her. The next night, returning home after work, Elizabeth felt an unusual sense of unease that grew as she entered the house. When she turned on the light in the living room, something about the mirror seemed off. She slowly stepped closer. Her reflection looked the same as always, but in the mirror, her eyes appeared hollow, like those of a doll. She instinctively touched her face to reassure herself that she was fine. But when she shone a lamp toward the mirror, everything appeared normal. She stepped back, trying to calm herself. The following day, Elizabeth decided to spend more time in the attic, sorting through her grandmother's belongings. Perhaps she could find something to distract her from her troubling thoughts. Among boxes of photographs, old letters, and books, she found a small envelope with her name on it. Opening it, she found a letter. Her grandmother's handwriting was clear, but the words carried a sense of urgency. "My dear, if you are reading this, it means I can no longer help you. The mirror in the house is not just furniture. It is dangerous. Never leave it uncovered at night. Cover it with cloth. If you ever feel that something is wrong, do not look into it and do not respond to your reflection." Her heart raced. Elizabeth read the words over and over, but their meaning remained the same. Her grandmother had known something about this mirror but had never explained it. Elizabeth couldn't believe in such superstitions, but after everything she had seen, fear began to take hold. That night, preparing for bed, she decided to follow her grandmother's advice. She found an old sheet, covered the mirror, and went to her bedroom. But sleep wouldn't come. She kept feeling as though she could hear noises from the living room. A faint rustling, like soft breathing, and a quiet, barely audible whisper. When the clock struck midnight, she decided to check. Walking into the living room with hesitant steps, she saw that the sheet had slipped off the mirror and was lying on the floor. The glass reflected only the dark room. But as she stepped closer, her reflection smiled. A chilling, wide smile, wider than she herself could ever smile. This time, she couldn't ignore it. Elizabeth felt a tightness in her chest, as if invisible hands were pulling her closer to the mirror. Even though she knew she should turn away, her feet seemed rooted to the floor. Her reflection raised its hand, even though she remained motionless. It touched the glass from the other side, and it seemed as though it was about to step through. Her thoughts of her grandmother's warnings mixed with fear and panic. Elizabeth retreated, ran from the room, and locked herself in her bedroom. But something deep inside her whispered, this night was only beginning. The day started as usual. Elizabeth tried to distract herself from the events of the previous night, convincing herself it was all just her imagination. But something about the living room made her feel uneasy. The mirror was once again uncovered, and even the daylight couldn't rid it of its eeriness. While brushing her teeth that morning, she glanced at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. It seemed normal, but something felt off. She raised her hand to touch her face and noticed that the reflection raised its hand a split second earlier than she did. That's impossible, she thought, but the feeling of unease didn't leave her. As the day went on, everything became stranger. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When Elizabeth walked past the mirror in the living room, her reflection stood perfectly still, even as she kept moving. She stopped abruptly, her heart pounding harder. The reflection stared directly into her eyes, and then it smiled. A wide, chilling smile stretched across its face, not touching its eyes. It lasted only a moment, but it was enough to send a cold wave of fear through her. That evening, she decided to cover the mirror and avoid looking into it any further. She pressed the sheet tightly against the glass, her hands trembling. It's just an object, she repeated to herself as she returned to her bedroom. But even when she fell asleep, her dreams were filled with shadows reaching for her from the darkness. In the middle of the night, a voice woke her, quiet, whispering, almost indistinct. Elizabeth. She opened her eyes and froze. The voice was coming from the living room. That was impossible. No one had called her, and there was no one else in the house. Summoning her courage, she grabbed a flashlight and slowly made her way downstairs. The flashlight beam trembled along with her hands as she entered the living room. The sheet lay on the floor, the mirror was uncovered, and once again, she saw her reflection. It looked at her, But this time, it didn't mimic her movements. She stepped closer, almost entranced, and suddenly her reflection raised its hand, though she remained motionless. Her reflection began to walk toward the glass from the other side, drawing closer and closer. And then, it stepped through. A figure emerged, resembling Elizabeth but not entirely. Its features were distorted. The smile was too wide, the eyes too dark, the movements too sharp. "Who are you?" she whispered, but her voice disappeared into the cold air. The doppelganger stepped closer, tilting its head as if studying her. "You are no longer needed," said the eerie version of her voice. Elizabeth felt her legs go weak. She tried to run, but the figure grabbed her arm. Its touch was icy, as if from another world. She struggled, but the doppelganger's strength was unnatural. They fell to the floor, and in the midst of the struggle, the mirror suddenly began to glow. The glass seemed to pulse with dark light, pulling everything around it into shadow. Elizabeth summoned all her strength, shoved the doppelganger away, and got to her feet. She grabbed the nearest object, a candlestick that was within reach, and struck the mirror with all her might. The frame splintered, the glass cracked, and a deafening crash echoed through the room. Her doppelganger screamed, but it wasn't a human sound. It was a noise like a howling wind that faded as the mirror shattered into pieces. Elizabeth collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. The darkness in the room dissipated, and everything seemed to return to normal. But as she stood up, she noticed that the shadows on the walls still moved. And though the mirror was gone, she knew this was far from over. The morning after that dreadful night was unnaturally quiet. Elizabeth woke up in her bed, feeling that something had changed. The room was the same as always, but there was something strange in the air, something invisible but palpable. She didn't remember falling asleep. The only things left in her memory were the sound of the shattering mirror and the doppelganger's scream. After getting up and heading to the kitchen, Elizabeth felt a strange chill. As she walked past the window, her gaze accidentally caught her reflection in the glass. It was there, but it looked slightly different. She stopped and leaned in closer. Her face was in the glass, but her eyes seemed darker, and the corners of her lips twitched faintly into a weak, almost imperceptible smile. She recoiled from the window, her heart pounding in her chest. "It's just my imagination," she told herself, but even her own voice sounded foreign to her. Throughout the day, Elizabeth tried to distract herself by going about her usual tasks. But every time she saw her shadow, she felt that something was wrong. At first, it was small things. When she moved, her shadow lingered for a fraction of a second longer than it should have. But over time, it became clear. Her shadow started to move differently, as if it had a life of its own. She sat at the table, but her shadow stood, tilting its head as though it was watching her. Elizabeth began avoiding reflective surfaces, but it became impossible. Her reflection followed her in windows, on her phone screen, even in her coffee cup. Every time she saw herself, the face looked like hers, but not quite. The eyes seemed hollow, and the faint smile sent chills down her spine. She began to realize the doppelganger, even if destroyed, had left something behind. She remembered her grandmother's words, "Don't respond to the reflection." But now it was too late. The feeling that she was no longer alone grew stronger with each passing moment. Her shadow, her reflection, all of it had become alien. Elizabeth could no longer trust even herself. That evening, sitting in the dark room, she stared at the shadow frozen on the opposite wall. It no longer moved in sync with her. It had a life of its own. The shadow slowly raised its hand, and a smile appeared on the wall. "This is only the beginning," whispered something from the depths of the room, but this time, the voice was her own. The mirror was gone, but had the evil truly disappeared? Are you sure your reflection is really you? If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. This is just the beginning of the stories we'll uncover here at Horror Haven. Don't forget to subscribe for more chilling tales, and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss the next journey into the unknown. Until next time, stay safe. Or, at the very least, stay in the light.